So welcome and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Chantel Warner. I'm one of the two co-directors of Circle, and we're really happy to have you here for today's talk. Before we start with the main event today, just a couple of announcements. So I know some of you are joining us and have been here for other Circle events before, or hopefully we'll have you back. But if this is your first time joining us for a Circle event, we just wanted to let you know that we're one of the 16 language resource centers that are funded by the Department of Education through the Title VI grant. We're housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona. And so we do have a resource page. We encourage you to check that out at the link there. And we also work very closely with our other centers, and you can find materials, resources, events, professional development, all kinds of resources on the NFLRC page too from all 16 of those centers. We also want to let you know about a couple of upcoming events that we have. So next month, March 26th, we have an in-person workshop. So we're really happy to be doing some in-person events again. And this is a workshop on designing translation materials for the world language classroom, which will be led by Sonia Colina and Sarah Albrecht. Because this is an in-person event, we have to limit participation a little bit. So there is a small application process in addition to the normal kind of registration, but you have that there at the link, or you can go to the Circle website to find that and apply to be a part of this workshop on designing translation materials. The webinar that we have for today is actually part of a webinar series. And so we have two other talks coming up on April 13th. We have a talk by Tracy Kwan, Strategies for Challenging Ideologies and Language Instruction. And then on May 11th, the Gender Just Language Education Project. Chris Knisley will be presenting on a project that he's been developing as a Circle fellow on the benefits, challenges, and strategies for engaging with trans knowledges in L2 teaching and learning. So we hope that we'll see you at those events as well. There's an interconnection between all of them in terms of kind of critical approaches to second language and culture teaching. So turning now to the main event for today, we're really happy to have Emma Trentman here with us today. Emma Trentman is Associate Professor of Arabic at the University of New Mexico and Interim Director of the Language Learning Center there. And her research focuses on language learning in study abroad contexts, virtual exchange, and on the language classroom with a focus on language ideologies and multilingual approaches, which is why when many of you told us that you wanted to have a webinar on translanguaging, she was the first person who came to mind to invite to have us come and talk with us about this. She's also the co-editor of Language Learning and Study Abroad, The Multilingual Turn, which appeared in 2021 through Multilingual Matters. And her research has appeared in a number of prestigious journals, the Modern Language Journal, Foreign Language Annals, the L2 Journal, Study Abroad Research and System, for example. She's also a co-editor of Critical Multilingualism Studies, and she directs the Arabic program at the University of New Mexico, where she also teaches Arabic classes and has directed the Star Talk Arabic summer program. So she brings a lot of this experience. And one of the things that I've always admired about her work, which I think we're also going to see in this webinar today, is how she really bridges theory and research and practice in a really powerful way. So with that, please join me in welcoming Emma Trentman to talk to us about translanguaging pedagogies in the world language classroom. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Chantal, and thank you so much to Circle for having me today. I always enjoy all of the Circle programming and conferences, so it's very exciting for me to give this talk as part of the webinar series, and exciting to see so many people joining from around the world. And yes, welcome from UNM. Ahlan, ya Naif. So I'm going to be talking about translanguaging in the world language classroom. And in a moment, I'm going to go into great detail about translanguaging and translanguaging theory. And I know that's what everyone is interested in. But I also wanted to explain what I mean by the world language classroom, especially because I know there's many people joining from all over the world, but world language classroom is sometimes more of a US-centric term. And so I'm based in the United States, where English is the socially dominant language. And so the world language classroom basically means languages other than English. world language classrooms in the United States can include students from a variety of backgrounds, including students who use the language of that classroom at home with relatives or within their local communities. Sometimes in the United States, world is also used to mean specifically languages from outside the US borders. But as you'll see from later in my presentation, I personally don't like that definition as much. But I thought it would be very confusing to title this talk Translanguaging in Classrooms Teaching Languages Other than English and English Dominant Contexts. That's a little unwieldy, so I just went with World Language Classroom. But I am specifically referring to teaching languages that aren't the socially dominant language. To give you an outline of what I'll be talking about, I'm going to start with a discussion of what is translanguaging from a theoretical perspective. Then I'm going to move into translanguaging pedagogies and to talk about translanguaging pedagogies. After giving a definition, I'm going to discuss them in terms of reframing existing practices and also creating transformative spaces. And I'm going to pause periodically throughout this so you can have questions, after each one of these sections, but I do encourage you to put in your questions throughout. I may not answer them right away, but I promise I will get to them eventually. And also, at times throughout this webinar, I'll be asking you to share your own experiences or to give comments of how you might have done something I'm talking about in your own classroom. And if you can put those descriptions in the chat, I'll also have Chantel read out some of those. And I think that will be very useful with such a global audience, because in some ways, translanguaging practices within our own classrooms are contextually specific. And so while I'll be sharing lots of examples from my classroom teaching Arabic in the United States, it can be very helpful to see examples from other contexts as well. And so I want to start actually by asking you what your questions are. And so if you can go ahead and put these in the Q&A, and Chantal, you can read them out as they come in. And the reason I'm asking this at the beginning is because I want to know, what specific questions are you coming to the webinar today with about translanguaging? And although I'm not going to answer them right away, I may be able to refer back to them during my presentation, or, specifically mention something when I get to that part of the presentation.
So I see Julio saying, so it has to do with maybe translating speech or words, but with questions. Gloria saying she hadn't heard this term until this talk, which I expect is not the only person who had that sense as well. Question about why is it so stigmatized still in Europe, and what is something that we can do to change that perception of translanguaging? Also the question of why translanguaging, why is it something that's so important for us to talk about in this context? How to use the L1 to enhance L2 learning. Oh, and I see some of you are posting in the Q&A as well because you paid attention. So is it necessary if you're in a monolingual context as well? Does translanguaging, or a thought that sometimes it seems at odds with the desire of world language teachers to create a kind of mini immersive environment? Is there a tension there? And is that something you could talk about? Quite a few people saying they're not quite clear what it is, that maybe they've heard it or only heard it in the context of this talk. What's some of the research trends there? How does it maybe contradict? I think this is similar to the immersion question. How does it contract ideas of an English medium instruction? And then some people saying, is it a fancy way to discuss using home languages in the classroom, or is there more to it because it's posed as a question? How do you deal with it as a teacher? Is it limited to natural bilinguals? I think that's a really interesting question. And then I want to try to make sure not to miss any. How does it look differently, or how can we think about it in multilingual context, not just in bilingual context? How do those relate together? And then the question of, if part of our imperative is to maximize target language use and target language instruction, how does this impact that, or how does that intersect with that?
All right. So those are all really great questions. And I hope another thing that everyone was able to see is that some of these questions repeat. So if you heard translanguaging or you've heard it before and you're like, what is this? I don't understand. What is going going on? Or how does this impact me when I'm supposed to be teaching in the target language? What about my context where it's multilingual? Then you're not the only one who has these questions. And so I'm going to be able to address most of these, I think, throughout the presentation. But again, I would encourage you, if we get to the end of the presentation and you think that I still haven't answered your question and you still have questions about it, please ask. And of course, I'm not the only expert on translanguaging. It's something that I think a lot of us are still working through, figuring out what it looks like for us in the classroom. So I'm going to move on and talk about what is translanguaging? And this is the question that I think a lot of people have. But actually, there's another question that we have to talk about before we can talk about what is translanguaging. And that is, what are language ideologies? Because as I'll be discussing in this presentation, in many ways, translanguaging and translanguaging approaches are a perspective shift rather than actually doing something different. It's more our perspective of what we're doing and what that looks like that is different. And so language ideologies, there's many definitions of these, but the one I like to use is these are our beliefs about language, what we think language is, what is a language, how do we learn language? But the important thing to realize is that these are socio-historically constructed perspectives. So we didn't just come up with these beliefs on our own, they're influenced by our lived experiences, our cultural backgrounds, our academic and educational backgrounds, what we talk about language, our training as language teachers, and so on. And also sometimes, especially in English, the word ideology has a negative connotation. And we think that we want to get rid of ideologies. They impact us negatively, they're bad, we don't want to do that. But in terms of language ideologies, it's crucial to realize that there is no ideologically neutral perspective. We are going to come to language learning and language teaching and language using with the beliefs about language. And so what I think is important is to focus on being aware of what our language ideologies are and how they're influencing our learning and our teaching and using of languages, so that we can make some conscious choices about which ideologies we want to support, what the implications of these ideologies are, and perhaps most importantly, not undermine our efforts to, say, create an inclusive classroom by relying on language ideologies that are inherently inequitable. So what do I mean by all of this? I'm going to start talking about monolingual language ideologies. These are the dominant ideology or belief system about languages in the United States and in many other places. And we could also think of these as nation state ideologies because they largely originate with European nationalism, where in order to create national entities, nations, political, linguistic, and ethnic borders were created as distinct and mutually reinforcing. So you could mark the border politically, and then you could mark it via language, you can mark it via ethnic groups. As we all know, this of course doesn't line up perfectly, but it's really the imagination and the creation of that in our minds. This perception, and I've represented that here on the side, thinking of languages as separate, distinct blocks. So we could have English and Arabic and Spanish, and these are all separate, distinct, bounded languages. That's a monolingual language ideology. And these ideologies were exported worldwide through colonialism, particularly via educational settings. So these ideologies aren't new, but they are very dominant in a lot of educational settings. Even just setting up a classroom as an Arabic classroom or a Spanish classroom really emphasizes these languages as separate. These ideologies are also prominent in research and practice in second language acquisition, applied linguistics, and what we used to call foreign, but are now shifting to world language teaching, which is basically teaching non-socially dominant languages. And sometimes when I talk about monolingual ideologies, people think of monolingual policies. So English only, or everyone in the United States should speak English. And these are coming from monolingual ideologies. I would consider them kind of an extreme example. And what I want to emphasize in this presentation is that we can also view multilingualism and we can approach language learning in ways that are rooted in monolingual language ideologies, even though we're promoting learning multiple languages. So what do I mean by that? If we talk about learning new languages in ways rooted in monolingual ideologies, this happens when we see native speakers of the standardized language representing the ideal linguistic behavior for learners to model. So rather than looking at what learners might actually be doing with their language in the future, when they're expanding their linguistic repertoires, we focus on how closely do they conform to this particular native speaker. And this is challenging because, I mean, as many of you know from all over the world, there's not that many people that fit well into this model of growing up monolingual with just one language, the standardized version. Of course, the people who do fit that model tend to be socially powerful. So this is why we see it. But this particular model of the native speaker is very much connected to social power and social dominance. And so it leaves out a lot of people. Secondly, when we talk about previous knowledge of dialects and languages interfering with learning new ones, that's also an approach rooted in monolingual language ideology. So when we talk about, oh, students speak a non-standard variety at home, and then this is interfering with their learning the standard variety in the classroom, or, well, because they're coming from this L1 background, you know, it's interfering with them learning this particular L2, that's another way. And then to touch on the immersion, which is one of the questions, so viewing monolingual immersion or monolingual classrooms as the ideal learning environment. This makes sense if you think of languages as completely separate. Then it would make sense that they would interfere, and it would make sense that, you know, just having that one language would be the best way to learn. But again, this is rooted in this idea of thinking of languages as separate bounded entities. And related to that as well, we see the valorization of study abroad or telecollaboration or virtual exchange, anything that promotes this immersion environment as sort of the real immersion. That's when you get to talk to these ideal native speakers. That's when you get to use that language only. And that's seen as very valuable and more valuable than, you know, other contexts of language learning. Another way we see this is when there's a focus on which language is being used in the classroom. So, you know, are my students using English or are they using Arabic? And really they should be using Arabic. They should be using more Arabic. Why are they using so much English? That is coming from a monolingual perspective. I'm looking at which language they're using, which of these separate languages, rather than, you know, what are they actually doing? And again, it emphasizes language as kind of this decontextualized object. So I could say, you know, this is Arabic and this is English and this is Spanish, and, you know, just state that definitively. So all of these are ways in which we can support language learning and we can support multilingualism, but we're doing it from monolingual perspectives. And so the contrast that I'm going to draw with that is translingual language ideologies. And this is, again, a different perspective on, you know, what language is really. And so here, I've represented it slightly differently on the side here. But the idea is that language boundaries are fluid and socially constructed. And so there's a real emphasis on the fact that people made these boundaries. We decided what counts as English and what counts as Arabic and what counts as Spanish. And so I've represented that over on the side here by having, you know, dotted borders and having these circles overlap. And what there's a strong emphasis on in translingual language ideologies is the linguistic repertoires of individuals rather than these social boundaries of named languages. So it's shifting from a language as a code, a separate object, to individuals and their linguistic repertoires. And these linguistic repertoires shift with time and lived experiences. So we don't have the same linguistic repertoire throughout our lifetime. What we do is draw from our linguistic repertoires in contextually specific ways. And this includes in educational settings or to learn. And when we draw from our linguistic repertoires in these contextually specific ways, what we produce may or may not correspond to named language boundaries? It might. So you could say, from this perspective, I am translanguaging right now. I'm also corresponding to the named boundaries of what we often call English. Although I guess translanguaging, you could argue, is perhaps not accessible to all English speakers or everyone who would identify as an English speaker. But oftentimes what we notice and what we pay attention to is when linguistic practices don't correspond to these socially named boundaries. And so there's also multiple names and multiple ways that this sort of perspective has been approached. And so you might hear terms like translanguaging, which is the one I'll be primarily focusing on, the multilingual turn. There are several books with that name. We put it in our book that Chantal mentioned. Plurilingualism is another term you'll hear that's getting at a similar ideological approach. And then the other thing I want to emphasize is that while these seem, really new to some of us, this type of perspective and this type of thinking about language, has been around for thousands of years. It's often just that the monolingual language ideologies, which are in fact relatively recent in their development, are so dominant, we sometimes don't recognize the existence of these other language or perspectives on language. So to focus specifically on translanguaging theory, which takes this, translingual ideological perspective. So translanguaging as a theory has been primarily developed in bilingual and heritage educational settings. For this reason, there's a strong social justice orientation to translanguaging theory in particular. And this is because of the context. So students in these contexts frequently come from marginalized populations, whether that's racially marginalized or socioeconomically marginalized, linguistically marginalized, and of course, in the US, as in many other places, there's intersections between these types of marginalization. And so there's an emphasis on recognizing and valuing the linguistic resources of socially marginalized populations rather than taking a deficit perspective. So rather than saying, well, this child speaks Spanish at home and it's, a non-standard variety, and this is a barrier to their education in this English dominant context, recognizing that this child is coming to school with linguistic resources that are serving them very well. And how do we build upon these resources for whatever we're trying to learn in our classes? And so this approach, translanguaging, is less common in world language classrooms where we're talking usually about, English dominant speakers learning other languages and maybe or maybe not having exposure to those languages elsewhere. But I think, as I'm going to argue in this presentation, I think it's just as important in world language classrooms, and we can really learn from these approaches that have been developed to support bilingual and heritage language students to develop our classrooms as well. And so I'm choosing this, going on to this definition of translanguaging. This is a quote that I really like, a definition of translanguaging from Utske et al. 2015, where they say translanguaging is the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named, usually national and state languages. And so here, again, they're showing that the emphasis is on the individual speaker's repertoire. They're in a particular context, they're deploying this repertoire, and they may or may not correspond to socially and politically defined boundaries. And, these usually are national and state, English, Arabic, French, etc. But in the case of Arabic, we could also think of this in terms of different geographic dialects. Is this Egyptian Arabic versus Jordanian or Darija, Moroccan, as we, and there's other ways, of course, of defining language. And so this is what we usually notice as translanguaging, because we're so used to these language boundaries. And just because they're socially defined doesn't mean they're not important and they don't impact our lives. So what we notice and what we tend to call translanguaging is when these boundaries are crossed. And of course, they're probably even more salient to us as language teachers because we're so focused on, our particular target language. But again, translanguaging is just drawing from the full linguistic repertoire in contextually specific ways. Okay, and so, again, I'm translanguaging right now. I'm drawing from the part of my linguistic repertoire that overlaps with the audience, with your linguistic repertoires. And, it does correspond to what we call English. And so finally, also, I'm going to be focusing on language and linguistic features in this talk, but translanguaging can also extend beyond this to other ways of meaning making, gestures, multimodal aspects, if we think about translanguaging, not just in spoken language, and so on. So again, it's a perspective shift. And to give you, a more concrete example of this is an example I like to use. I use it actually with my students as well. I'll get into making this explicit for students. But what I've been trying to emphasize from a theoretical perspective is that translanguaging is oftentimes more of a perspective shift than actually doing something different. And so a question that I often get asked is, well, you're talking about crossing socially named language boundaries. So what's the difference between translanguaging and code switching? Okay, so we can look at this example. This is from a research project I did. And so this is from an interview with a Jordanian language partner who's explaining why he wanted to be a language partner for this study abroad program. And I'm the person who is interviewing him. And so when I asked him about his participation in the program, he said, بالنسبة لي أنا أول شيء مهم هو إثبات قدراتي اللغوية to improve my language, and وزي ما حكى نديم, the true image about the Middle East and Islam, or about Arabs. So in this utterance, he's clearly not corresponding to socially named language boundaries. And in code switching, that's what we often focus on, is which language is he using when? And we might want to ask why too. Why does he choose to switch? Why is he using these two languages? But the emphasis is really on which code is which, like which part is Arabic and which part is English, okay? And we might mark it and code it as different languages. If we looked at the exact same utterance and took a translanguaging perspective, we're going to focus on the individual's linguistic repertoire. So in this case, Ghulam, who is the Jordanian student, his linguistic repertoire includes elements from the named languages of English and Arabic, and also Russian. And other, we'll get into everything our linguistic repertoires include in a bit, but, other dialects and of course, contextually specific examples. But in this interview, he's talking to me. And so he's drawing from the parts of his linguistic repertoire that overlap with mine. So he's not going to draw from the parts that overlap with someone who speaks Russian, because then I won't understand him. And so this is a choice here. And so again, we can look at that same exact utterance and take a code switching perspective rooted in these monolingual language ideologies of separate languages, or we can take a translingual perspective and look at the individual repertoire and how it overlaps with these socially named languages. And so I want to pause for a moment. This is our theoretical discussion. And if we make this perspective shift, I want you to think about your own linguistic repertoire and how this has maybe shifted or changed over time, and how you draw from it in specific contexts. And so if when we think about our own linguistic repertoires, often, especially as language teachers, the first thing we think of is these socially named languages, and really the ones that we feel like we're good at or that we're fluent in. So I might say, my linguistic repertoire is Arabic and English. But if I think about it a little bit more, and I think of it in terms of what linguistic resources do I have, rather than, which languages am I good at, I could say, well, I studied French when I was younger, and some Turkish and Scottish Gaelic, and maybe I don't use those the way I do English and Arabic, but they're still useful when I come across, names to pronounce, or quotations in research articles that are in French, and so on. I could say, I don't think of myself as speaking Spanish at all, but after, a year plus of virtual school with my daughter in a school that's bilingual in English and Spanish, my receptive skills at reading second grade worksheets in Spanish have gotten a lot better. And so that is also part of my linguistic repertoire. We can also think of dialects and sociolinguistic variation, so different places we've lived, we're more familiar with the dialects of. So, I don't think of myself as speaking every Arabic dialect, but the more I listen to them, the more I engage with media from different places, the more I understand. The same thing in English, of course, living in different parts of the United States, having family from different areas, listening to media from other English speakers all over the world, expands my linguistic repertoire. We can also think of activity-specific jargon. So Scottish Highland dancing is one of my favorite activities. And I mentioned in this presentation, I'm corresponding to socially named boundaries. I'm just using English. At the same time, if I told you to perform a shedding movement or a stress bay across the floor or show me some potty buzz, this probably isn't accessible to many in this audience, although if it is, please let me know. I'll be very excited. The stress bay is pictured. Yes, Kate, I see that in the chat. The stress bay is pictured in this photo here. And so we can have parts of our linguistic repertoire that are activity specific or specific to a very small context. It could be our family. So when I have 2 children, and when my son was born, the second child, my daughter got confused between baby and the let that you put on the end of baby names, piglet or something. And so she called him her babelet. And now that word has expanded to just mean kids in our family. So we'll refer to both kids as babelets. This isn't really comprehensible, perhaps outside of my immediate family, but again, it's part of my linguistic repertoire. And so, again, think through this and go ahead and put in the chat, if you want to, what you think of as your linguistic repertoire. So I'm going to pause for a couple minutes and let everyone do that. Think through all these different types. And then also, if you have any questions or comments about translanguaging at this point, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A. I'm going to try to answer questions about the theoretical perspective before I move on to pedagogies and practices. So questions in the Q&A, descriptions of your linguistic repertoire, or comments in the chat. And Chantal, if you want to read those out, go ahead.
Yes, as people are starting to post, I'll just let you all know, I've been trying to, the questions you'd post at the beginning, if I hear it get answered already in the talk, I'm trying to flag it as answered, but if you still have a follow-up question, do feel free to post those in the Q&A. So I saw a couple of people immediately responding that they do share that Scottish country dancing repertoire with you, so that is part of theirs. And then also other kinds of activities like soccer is the example there that create specific repertoires. But then also languages like Persian, Turkish, Kurdish, and English, German, English, Italian, also dialects that are spoken, and then so Arabic dialects spoken at home, linguistic repertoires relating to also different roles. So role of mom, teacher, interpreter, those kinds of repertoires. Composed of standard American English and standard Mexican Spanish, but also Chicano English, Sonoran Spanish. So getting into these regional varieties as well as dialects, Northern Mexican Spanish, Southwest Latino English, and Spanglish. Then also pedagogy as being a repertoire. I like pointing that out, as well as some other activities like knitting, crocheting, embroidery, where I suspect you also get borrowed words across different languages as well. Indonesian, Javanese, Chinese, English, other people commenting on these roles and positions as being part of repertoires. Currently working, that's impressive, Andrew, currently working on 13th language, and it's great to talk about perspectives. But also that there are different skill levels in these different languages and attrition. So I think that also brings in the question of not all the repertoires necessarily being the same in terms of how large they are for an individual person, or how comfortable one is with them. So Spanish, English, and French and Portuguese. We have a lot of languages represented here. I saw somebody also saying gay lingo in particular contexts. So thinking also of different kinds of varieties of language that are tied to different communities. And then also jargon about disabilities. So someone posting that with physical disability, there's a whole other set of repertoire that you learn around talking about disability and disability studies, language relating to LGBTQ plus communities. So yeah, I think I didn't quite catch everyone, but I've tried to catch as many of them as possible.
Yeah, no, these are great. And I hope everyone's able to see, just how expansive our linguistic repertoires are when we think of them this way, instead of thinking of them as, being fluent in a specific bounded language. And in terms of, the attrition and shifting over time, I think the other thing that translingual perspectives give us is sort of, the permission almost to see this as natural, and this is what will happen, rather than as a failure because we didn't remain as, 13 monolinguals throughout our lifetimes. And so again, it's the shift to seeing all of our linguistic repertoire as a resource that certainly we can expand. As language teachers, we want to keep doing that, but not as something so just fixed in specific definitions of socially named languages. Are there any questions that came through from a theoretical perspective so far?
I know one of them is what you were already getting at. There was a question earlier that was a little bit of a provocation, but I think it's important about whether a translanguaging approach risks glorifying partial repertoires, or how you see that.
Yeah, I think the idea here is, again, we want to look at this as a resource, but in an educational setting in particular, we are always trying to expand our repertoires. So we may have, limited, our linguistic repertoire may be limited compared to someone else in a socially named language. And the question is, do we want to see that? What I think the translingual perspective gives us is recognizing what we do have, and then being able to potentially expand it if that's of interest to the individual or the context or whatever, rather than saying, well, you're not at this level yet, or you have these other things that are going to hold you back from getting to this level. And so I think that's where, that would be my perspective on it, that it's not saying like, oh, well, great, you have something, now you don't need to do anything. Do you want to learn more? And let's use this as a resource to get you there. Any other theoretical questions?
I think most of the questions that are lingering now that I'm going to hold on to start to relate to pedagogy and to
okay.
in the classroom. So I think your point about this is also tied to what somebody's intentions and desires are is maybe a good segue.
Yeah, so this is the thing that we want to. And so I'm going to get into the translanguaging pedagogies now, because often, the theory is nice. It's great. It's interesting to think about. But usually we want to know, well, what do we actually do in our classrooms? So translanguaging pedagogies, what are they? Essentially, they emphasize recognizing and using the full linguistic repertoire to learn content and language. And so this is kind of what I was alluding to before, is, recognizing this linguistic repertoire and then trying to expand it, in a language classroom in particular. And so what this does is encourage intentional and strategic use of the full linguistic repertoire as a skill, and we don't see it as a failure to be monolingual, or, well, you're just not quite there yet. So instead of saying, well, you can't do this activity in Mandarin, we say, well, what do you have, how can we build up to, maybe your goal is to be able to do something monolingually. Maybe it's not, we'll get into that as well. But essentially seeing this full linguistic repertoire as a resource, as something we can use, as something we already have to build on, rather than something that will hold us back or is irrelevant or it doesn't matter. It's also, of course, this is a question I get a lot too. It's not the same as anything goes. This doesn't mean I can just do whatever I want. at any time, so I can't be like, well, there's 2 people or 3 people who understood these Highland dance terms, and so now I'm going to switch my entire presentation to just telling you about Highland dance theory, and great, right? That wouldn't achieve my goal. So I still have to be strategic in my deployment of my repertoire. I can't say, oh, I see there's a lot of people in the chat who speak Arabic, and so now I'm just going to أتكلم باللغة العربية وأشرح translanguaging باللغة العربية. Like, that's also not accessible. So it's still strategic, and it's really realizing how you are going to be strategic about using your linguistic repertoire. And so what I like to say, and the question I like to pose related to this is, how can we build upon our students' full linguistic repertoires to expand them? So recognizing everything that they're coming to our classrooms with, and then we're going to try to expand them in, the direction of a particular socially named language and resources associated with that. But that's kind of a different perspective than how can I just teach Arabic? And so also, as I mentioned earlier, translanguaging in particular has a strong foundation in social justice and in recognizing the ways in which race and language and power shape our classrooms and shape our educational experiences. And so I think as part of translanguaging pedagogies in particular, it's important to draw attention to the intersection of language and power, to include discussions of colonialism, racism, gender, ableism, and other social inequities in the classroom, and to emphasize connections between language and social justice or social inequities, because often these are one of the ways in which these inequities are embodied or carried out is through language. When we talk about world languages, if we go back to originally, I said I didn't like the definition of languages that are from, out with the US borders. You can probably see why now. It's very much focused on that sort of language and national and ethnic boundary. But I also think it's important to recognize that a lot of the world languages that we teach, I mean, if we think of world languages as being widespread throughout the world, often one of the reasons that they got that widespread nature is colonialism. And so it's important in all of these languages we teach to see how sort of their dominance as one of the world's top languages or most spoken languages comes through colonialism or other types of, violent expansion. And then another thing that comes up is, well, aren't these extra? This is going to take away from my time in the target language. And I think we have to reframe this as these are essential, because having this understanding of language and power and language ideologies can actually really enhance our language learning. Perhaps in the very, very short term, if we have a 50-minute class and we spend half of it talking about these language ideologies and, settler colonialism and social inequities, yes, that is 25 minutes less that you didn't spend practicing introductions or trying to order food or something like this. At the same time, if we think of language learning as a long-term activity, and I think all of us know that it is a very long-term activity, this can be very beneficial down the road, especially for preparing our students when they're outside of our classrooms and they're dealing with language ideologies or language judgments. And something that comes up, I teach Arabic, but I also teach a capstone class for what we have a languages major at the University of New Mexico. And so these students take this capstone class where we talk a lot about language ideologies and perspectives and things like this. And what the students often say is, why didn't I learn this earlier? Why wasn't this part of my actual language class? This would have been so helpful, to realize that, when I speak Spanish with my grandparents, it's not bad Spanish, or to realize that, I don't need to become a monolingual person, or I don't need to be a monolingual Mandarin speaker, or, everyone in my language class was working hard regardless of their background in the language. And so I think, these aren't necessarily extra. And so that's kind of an overview of translanguaging pedagogies. And the next thing I want to get into is, perhaps the most important question, the one I like to ask and the one that people usually ask as well, is what does this actually look like in class? So again, this is kind of a theoretical approach to translanguaging pedagogies that I talked about, but what does it look like in class? And I'm going to start with this idea of reframing existing practices. So I talked about, how we could reframe utterances that don't correspond to socially named languages from either a monolingual or a translingual perspective. And we can do this with a lot of practices that already exist in our classrooms. And I think this is something that's important for us all to realize, is that regardless of our perspective, these practices are there. And so if we reframe how we perceive our existing practices in our classroom, this is part of engaging in translanguaging pedagogies and can be, very beneficial for us, but also for our students. So I'm going to start with some examples. So here the teacher comes in, this is like an elementary Arabic class. We're learning about drinks. And so I come in and I say, "Ana ashrab Coca-Cola." And so I have this gesture, you can tell I'm drinking something. I probably have a picture up on the screen of, various drinks. And, I'm talking about Coca-Cola, which I actually don't like to drink at all. But from a monolingual perspective, we might say, oh, this is great. The teacher is using cognates to provide comprehensible input. So I chose Coca-Cola because I know that students will recognize this. But I'm still focusing on that this is a word that's the same in these two separate languages. From a translingual perspective, you could shift this slightly and say the teacher is strategically drawing from the overlap between their linguistic repertoire and the students to expand the latter. So by choosing a word that's shared in the linguistic repertoire, whether we call it a cognate or not, it can expand the student's repertoire to include ashrab, to drink. And so this, again, is a very strategic choice. The teacher didn't choose any drink. The teacher didn't choose any, thing to use with Coca-Cola. But with all of these, with the picture, with the motion, with expanding, the teacher is expanding linguistic repertoire. And so this, you can probably think of many, many sentences you use in your own classroom where you engage in a practice like this when you're teaching. And again, it's just a perspective shift. So I'm going to go through a few more of these. And this time what I'm going to do is, I'll present the practice, I'll describe it, I'll give you, a monolingual perspective on it. And then I'm going to ask you to actually type in the chat what you think a translingual perspective on the exact same practice would be, if we think of this idea of focusing on the linguistic repertoire and building on it. And of course, there's not one answer. So people could put multiple answers, multiple ways this is a translingual approach in the chat, and they're all correct. And hopefully I set up my animations correctly to make this work. So our next example, we have the student who is describing their daily routine, another thing that's common in lower level language classes. And so as you can see, they're, speaking in Arabic. This is Arabic class after all, but there's a few words and probably they just don't know these in Arabic. They're talking about their work at the health insurance office. They don't know the word for health insurance, and they're talking about their classes. And so we gave out a list of classes. We probably included Arabic class, of course, and history, but maybe we didn't put ceramics on our vocabulary list. So they just said that in English. And then the teacher responds and, gives them the word for health insurance in their response. And, that reply is all in Arabic. So from a monolingual perspective, you might say something, well, the student's doing a good job. They're using mostly Arabic, so they're mostly keeping to the target language. That's good. We can ignore a little English, and it's, a scaffold to getting them to this monolingual content. And the teacher's doing a really good job of, responding, but keeping it all in Arabic. So again, we have this emphasis on, when they're using Arabic, when they're using English. Oh yeah, it's really good they're using Arabic. English isn't so great, but we'll ignore it. So that's a monolingual perspective. There's other monolingual perspectives as well, but go ahead and tell me in the chat what you think a more translingual perspective on this same exchange. The student putting in a few words they don't know in English, and then the teacher responding in Arabic and providing some of that vocabulary. And Chantal, if you want to read those out, if they come in.
So somebody suggesting health insurance is their professional world. So that's related to job specific jargon. The teacher is helping the student to expand their linguistic repertoire here. The student is in the process of expanding his or her vocabulary, which I think in some ways I might go ahead and thread this in, because that was a question that came up in a couple of places, is how to balance a translanguaging approach with students learning new words and vocabulary. The student is using their other language resources, in this case English, to help them create a full phrase. The teacher doesn't point out that the student used English, so broke the monolingual code. I like that, but instead helps them to expand their lexis and then continues on. The student is communicating the content of their daily routine, also drawing on their English repertoire to give more full information. And the teacher is following up with a very normal response, of one that would often come up in conversation, and helping provide the Arabic vocab terms. Somebody observing that this is something that often happens to them, kind of being familiar, friendly with the teacher to speak a common dialect that we both understand. The teacher here is trying to help the students to access their linguistic repertoire to understand and answer. So people kind of seeing this as a bridging that linguistic repertoire in Arabic by helping to provide the term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these are all, I'm going to put up another response as well, but these are all great and brought up things that you're not going to see on my slide. So that's important to think. So yeah, so the student, as you mentioned, is drawing from their full linguistic repertoire, and they're continuing to speak in Arabic. You know, they're not stopping and being like, oh my gosh, I studied the word for health insurance 10 times last night. I still can't remember it. What is wrong with me? Why can't I, be this perfect Arabic speaker and know this word that I studied so much? Some of us have done that in the past to ourselves. And the teacher, who also, again, speaks English, right? So the teacher isn't like, oh my gosh, I didn't understand when you said health insurance. The teacher knows, it's a bilingual environment for English and Arabic in this classroom. So the teacher is recognizing that part of the student's linguistic repertoire and then helping them expand it by filling in the vocabulary, as many of you mentioned. So again, focusing on this linguistic repertoire and expansion. Our next example is one you might also recognize. So when you're in a class and you have the students work in small groups, and then they're supposed to prepare a skit to present in front of the class. So in this one, it's going to be about planning their weekend routine. And so in the small groups, it's common to hear students translanguaging more without regard to linguistic boundaries, or using more English and Arabic if we want to have it from a monolingual perspective. So the student they're kind of planning out what they're going to do. And so the student says, oh, you could ask me if I'm going to a cinema. And I'd say, I have a lot of homework. And then when they get in front of class, they do actually produce a monolingual product. So, first student says in Arabic, are you going to the movies Saturday? And the other one says, no, I have a lot of homework for Arabic class. This comes up a lot, making fun of the Arabic teachers we give them so much homework. And so then from a monolingual perspective, you might focus on the fact that, like, in the small groups, they're using English and say, how do we get them to use more Arabic when they're in their small groups? They're always using so much English, and this is supposed to be a target language immersion classroom. But, hey, at least they did use all Arabic in their presentation. When they got in front of the class, they were finally monolingual. So if we recast this same instance from class, from a translingual perspective, what are your ideas on that? And again, go ahead and put this in the chat. So how could we look at the same exact thing that happens in our class from a translingual perspective?
So one observation that code switching in these examples is facilitating the learning.
Mm-hmm. I can go ahead. What I noticed in this, and again, there's multiple things, is there's a difference between sort of the processing and the product. Yeah, so now I see it. They use their L1 for planning. So they're using their full linguistic repertoire, again, which is shared, right, between these students to work together in the learning process. And then this is helping them expand it so they can create this monolingual final product. Again, I'll get to this later. It may not always be that the goal is a monolingual final product, but in this case, that was what they were assigned. So they're producing this monolingual skit, but drawing from their full linguistic repertoire in the planning process was essential to their being able to do this. And so that's how we might take a more translingual perspective. Our next example, we're kind of moving out of the classroom a little bit here. And so this is maybe if you have a language partner, this could be, if you have language partners locally, if you have someone in a virtual exchange and study abroad, et cetera. And so here they're discussing some cultural information. And so the student asks, how do you celebrate Ramadan in English? They might not know the word for celebrate, or they're not sure if it's the same word, Ramadan is the same word in English or Arabic. But then they fill in, do you go to the mosque or eat with family, and then the language partner responds, starting out, نعم الوقت مع العائلة والأصدقاء مهم جدا. So if time with family and friends is important. And then they say, again, family is very, very important. And so, again, from a monolingual perspective, we would be focusing on which language they're using when, and maybe it's too much English, or why are they using so much English? And, the language partner at least is fluent in Arabic and English. So why are they saying things in English that they could say in Arabic? There's other monolingual perspectives as well, but go ahead and tell me what you think would, again, be a more translingual perspective on this conversation between the student and their language partner.
So Cecilia's saying, I teach Spanish in 5th and 7th grades. They only speak Spanish, and that can be done. So I think that's a question we can come back to it, but I do know, I think the question of how is this at odds with an immersion kind of mindset does keep coming up. So limiting the cognitive dissonance to a tolerable level, that could be a lot of new information vocabulary at once. So it needs extra linguistic knowledge here. The language partner may also be practicing their L2. They can communicate in the full range of the repertoire for both partners, so the L1 and the L2.
Yeah, so all of these are great points. And so again, I think what we want to look at from a translingual perspective is how both speakers are drawing from their full linguistic repertoire. So the student, is interested in learning Arabic, but they also really want to know about Ramadan traditions. This is something that they're curious about. This is something a lot of students want to know, and they may not have a background in, or and it may be different in their family versus the person they're talking to. And so they're really trying to focus on this content as well as language. And so this makes them draw from their full linguistic repertoire. We could make a similar comment about the partner. So they're drawing from their full linguistic repertoire to make sure that the student understands the cultural information. And I think this is something that's important. Again, if we think back to the idea of translanguaging and translanguaging theory being rooted in social justice, in the context of Arabic in particular, and we saw this, even in the original example I gave to talk about the difference between translanguaging and code switching. If we think of this as being in the United States, where there is Islamophobia, there's a lot of negative stereotypes about Arabs and Arabic and Arab culture. It's very important to a lot of language partners to counteract these stereotypes and to provide information that doesn't feed Islamophobia and other negative stereotypes. And so it may be really important for that language partner to ensure that the student is getting that actual information and is getting positive images about Arabs and Arabic speakers, rather than, just ensuring that they understood the word for family and the word for friend. And so this is another way where we can look at the linguistic repertoire, not only as a way to expand our language knowledge, but also our knowledge of cultural information or other content. So moving on to one of my favorite examples. So these are some internet memes we use in the first few weeks of Arabic class when students are just learning the letters. So basically, some of you will get these, but otherwise, all you need to know is the names of the Arabic letters. When I saw you, I was like, wow. I was a meme before the internet. So, we've had memes in Arabic for a long time. The one on the bottom is, again, just using the letters. So no pain, no ghain, hit me up in the afternoon, Mary had a little lamb. My calf muscles are sore after going to the gym. I'm really not feeling well. I have such an awful cough. And this plays on like those two letters being different in Arabic. She made this into an internet meme, seeing a pretty boy like, wow, he also funny, ha ha. And then the one with the elephant, so the word for elephant in Arabic is feel. And so I feel good. And so these are, things that are kind of funny. We use them in first few weeks of Arabic class. And so from a monolingual perspective, again, we'd be like, oh, these are Arabic letters. These are funny jokes. What might be a more translingual perspective on these, memes from week 3 Arabic?
So I already saw one comment that's about, I think that might have been about the last one actually, but maybe it ties in here too, about ways of showing respect for the multiple languages. There's creativity going on here. People are making use of their full repertoire of accessing that, starting from students' lived experiences and connecting that. And maybe a variation on that memes are a generational language. So that brings in also that aspect of the repertoire that's part of kind of a sociolect of people of a certain age, and incorporating that into the knowledge of Arabic, and allows them then to understand these sayings, to get the joke so that it's used for these humorous purposes, that they require, and that these are texts that require them to use both repertoires, and actually encourage them to kind of play with that and with the language. It gives them examples that help them to think about similarities and differences between the sounds in Arabic and English. Plays with the mnemonics, because they might be more likely to remember them if they've got the meme in their heads. Yeah, a couple people echoing that. And then that it's also helping to build a multilingual community, a space in which being multilingual is valued, and that it helps you to get the joke, since you need both of the languages in order to understand any of these.
Yeah, so these are all great. And again, there's this idea of, expanding the existing linguistic repertoire using humor, which is also social connection. So, generationally, as some people brought up, or, you building a multilingual community, you can't get these jokes unless you have access to shared parts of these repertoires. So hopefully this gives you some examples of things that, I'm sure all of these practices already exist in your language classes. And so in many ways, it's just, reframing them. So instead of focusing on, which language students are using, how they're drawing from their full linguistic repertoires to learn new things. And so I'm going to address some questions that come up, and then I'll talk about a little bit about this idea of, immersion and staying in the target language. And so some questions I get is, does this mean students can just use whatever language they want, whenever? What if they're lazy and they just use English and they don't use the target language? And we could add actually to this the question that came up before, but what if my students can do this, all in the target language? And so I would say, again, this is still a monolingual perspective. You're focusing on these languages as separate. And what I often tell my students to ask themselves is, are my linguistic choices helping me expand my linguistic repertoire the way I want? So you can't expand your linguistic repertoire to include certain features without using them. What I think we need to shift away from is saying that using those all the time, every time, is the only way to do that. So if your students are using, the target language all the time, translanguaging perspective doesn't mean that they can't do that or that they shouldn't do that. That might be an example of them making the linguistic choices to expand their linguistic repertoire. At the same time, it means that if other students make other choices, they could still be expanding their linguistic repertoires without adhering to monolingual measures of which language they're using. And so it's kind of a more expansive perspective that really asks us to think about what we're doing with language and why. And then the other thing to keep in mind is, it's still always a multilingual setting. And I'll get into this in a little bit more. But even if students are producing stuff monolingually, even if I'm giving this presentation in English, the other aspects of my linguistic repertoire are still there. And that may give me a different perspective on questions or comments in the chat related to Arabic than related to, a language I'm not familiar with. So this is the idea of reframing existing practices. And I do want to pause just for a second to ask for any other questions before I move on to this idea of creating transformative spaces in the classroom via translanguaging approaches.
Yeah,
So if you have any specific questions about anything that's come up so far, go ahead and put those in the Q&A and I'll have Chantal read them.
yeah, I have a couple I've been gathering. So there were more comments, but I think they tied into exactly what you were just talking about, this this idea of it being a reframing, and also us raising awareness of the fact that we do different things with language. We don't just communicate information, but people have mentioned the social connection, the respect, authenticity, that these are also things that that people try to convey with language. That in some ways tied into, there were a cluster of questions. I've tried to group them all together, where people were saying, well, how do we do that in a classroom that's really diverse? So how many languages can we accommodate? What if you have students who are multilingual, monolingual, and bilingual, and are coming in with really different linguistic repertoires? Maybe you have 20 to 30 students. Someone was asking, how do you create that space to do that? And people were noting that it really takes creating a good discourse community, but wanted to know if you had any good strategies for how you do that, or approaches in which you deal with kind of the vast diversity of the repertoires that people might be bringing to the classroom.
Yeah, so I'm going to get to this in a little bit, but I'll just mention that in terms of, having really diverse linguistic repertoires in your classroom, I mean, this is the reality in many, many places in the world. So I think we need to, just see that this is reality, and it's not, sort of the same way that it's not a barrier to learning new languages to already speak one. Having these linguistic repertoires, viewing them as a resource, is really important. And I think we can do this explicitly, asking students to really think about their linguistic repertoires. So I do a similar exercise with my students who, might seem at first like they have the same linguistic repertoire. They're all English speakers and they're learning Arabic, but almost no one in the United States takes Arabic as their second language. And so typically they have a lot more linguistic resources at their disposal that I might not know about if I don't ask them. And so having students think through their linguistic repertoires, share if they want to. I mean, I don't think anyone should be forced to share. Asking them to give examples, thinking about socially named languages, thinking about dialects, thinking about community-specific context, religious terminology, activity-specific terminology. I think getting students to think about them in the first place, having us learn about them to the extent that students want to share, and then trying to make connections. And I am going to give some specific examples of making connections with existing linguistic repertoires upcoming in the presentation. But I think, that's in some ways, I mean, that can be an advantage in a translingual perspective. Are there any other questions related to this?
There's maybe two more, if that's okay. So one is about what are some of you led us through these examples of how we can kind of reframe our own thinking. Are there some concrete ways in which you frame and plan and execute pedagogical activities differently, giving directions or feedback or types of tasks to help students to reinterpret their own linguistic practices in the classroom from a translingual perspective?
So I actually give a very similar version of this presentation. I mean, those including some of those same examples to my students. And what I ask them is, how is this an example of translanguaging, to learn Arabic? Or how is this helping? How are these students expanding their linguistic repertoire? And so, I mean, I do think, and I'll mention this later, because monolingual language ideologies are so dominant in US society, and I mean, in many places, and we rarely talk about language ideologies. So students often, I mean, through no fault of their own, don't even realize that this is a thing that exists. And so I think it does have to be pointed out to them explicitly. And in a lot of ways, it can kind of, free students up to just try things and try to learn instead of feeling like they're constantly failing because they're not able to be monolingual. And was there another question?
Maybe just one that I'll thread in now.
Mhm.
It's come up in a variety of different ways, but I think a lot of language educators who've been trained to think about language teaching in terms of input and comprehensible input. I think that's come up in a couple of different ways of how do you address concerns that that come from people that, well, then are the students getting enough input? I have a feeling you might use different terms there, but how would you respond to that concern?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, obviously we have to be exposed to language. We have to use the language in order to include it in our linguistic repertoire. So it's not as though you can just see something once and then it's part of your repertoire. Maybe if it's really memorable. So this doesn't mean that, input and providing examples and exposure and, using those linguistic resources associated with the target language isn't important. It's still essential. It's very important. What we're trying to do in shifting the perspective is to say that that's not the only thing that's important. And that if we have other linguistic resources associated with other socially named languages, those can help us too. So I would say it's more additive than, saying like a one for one. Well, if I use this in, something that's not my target language, it's taking away from that opportunity to use it in the target language. That's very, again, back to this idea of having separate languages and it's either this one or this one, looking at it more holistically as a way to continually build. But, none of this means that, we don't use linguistic resources. We're trying to help our students learn. All right, any other questions before I go on to creating transformative spaces?
I have a couple I might hold on to until after you've done this section, and we'll come back to them.
All right. Okay. So I talked about reframing existing practices, and I also want to talk about creating transformative spaces, because this is really, again, if we look at it from a translanguaging perspective and talking about social justice and social inequities, this is where I think another powerful part of translanguaging pedagogies come in. And so I talked about, and I think I was just talking about this, one way is to recognize and validate students' existing linguistic competencies. Ask them to think about what their linguistic repertoires are. How do what they already know prepare them to expand their linguistic repertoires to include new resources associated with socially named languages, and how do global structures of inequity position these linguistic repertoires? So not all linguistic repertoires are valued equally socially. And I think it's important to point that out, because sometimes we're so focused on the language that we don't realize that judgments about non-standardized form are actually tied into judgments about race or class or ability or gender or things like this. And again, I do think this needs to be very explicit, because we don't talk about language ideologies in our everyday life. I mean, maybe I do, but lots of people don't. And so students don't necessarily come in with the vocabulary, with the linguistic repertoire to talk about this. So that's one step. And then also to recognize the multilingual nature of many language learning situations. And so this includes study abroad, language classrooms, virtual exchange, engagement with local communities. And this is true whether or not what's going on at that particular moment corresponds to socially named language boundaries or not. So if students are having a monolingual conversation with their classmate, their whole linguistic repertoire is still present. It's still a multilingual situation, because they still have access to those resources, even if they're not using them at that moment. So in terms of, study abroad and virtual exchange, and this is some of my more recent work, a lot of these contexts that are imagined as monolingual immersion, and what happens is students go abroad and then are very disappointed that they didn't have monolingual immersion, or that they're struggling to be monolingual or act monolingually, or people are speaking to them in English, or all of these things. I think, we can shift this question to ask, how do we prepare students to engage in multilingual settings in order to expand their linguistic repertoires, rather than, how can they be more monolingual? How can we make this multilingual situation more monolingual? And so, this in the context of English speakers and global English, which is what I hear about a lot, and, get complaints about everyone speaking to me in English. This means shifting the perspective to global English as one resource in the linguistic repertoire, not this threat that needs to be contained or fought through a monolingual pledge, or, let's find a really rural location where there's only monolingual speakers of, Arabic or Turkish or whatever. But to see it as, a resource that can be used to make social connections, to meet people who you then might engage with using, other languages and other parts of your linguistic repertoire, or potentially something you could even improve by learning to understand new varieties and new accents in English and expanding your own linguistic repertoire in this language that you thought you already spoke very well. And as an example of this, I just wanted to share this quote from a student from my chapter in our book. So this is a student who was from the United States, a heritage learner of Spanish, studying English in Oman. And he met the person who became his best friend in Oman actually through his knowledge of English and Spanish. This was a Omani who was learning Spanish, and this was unusual. So they wanted to meet each other. And then when they met, and they became really good friends, and they would hang out a lot using all of their languages. And I think what you can see in this quote is really how, even though this student could produce things monolingually in English and in Spanish and in Arabic, really the goal was not monolingualism, this social connection created through this shared linguistic repertoire, even if they weren't always using all parts of it at one time. But the fact that they could drew them together. And so, I'll let you read the quote, but I think it's very powerful, this idea that, he's a complete person when all of these linguistic resources are available to him. And I didn't put up the whole quote, but in another part of it, he talks about having like these ghosts that are there when he's only operating monolingually. Another way in class, I'll go through this. I do want to be mindful of the time of the webinar, but all of you just have such great comments that I want to hear them too. We can think about this using multilingual and multidialectal materials. And here I'm specifically focusing on Arabic, but of course, all languages have variation in them. And so it's important to use examples representing a variety of linguistic repertoires in class, both for exposure to expand the linguistic repertoire, the same way we think of expanding it generally with a language, but also to show the diversity of speakers who use what we might call the target language or the socially named language, and to not limit it just to, again, these sort of idealized, in Arabic, this is often called the educated native speaker. This person who grew up monolingual and has a certain level of education is from what we're not saying, a certain class or racial or other social background that's privileged in that in society. And again, when we do this, we can specifically draw students' attention to sociolinguistic and pragmatic features and build upon their existing resources. And so this is when I was saying, knowing what your students' linguistic repertoires are useful. So here, I have a page from our website where we post resources. It's 3 different dialects, it's 3 different religious holidays in this unit. And so we might, when we get to the Moroccan text, which maybe students are less familiar with, we can point out specific, parts of it, like there you put a k in front of the verb instead of a b, but you already know what this is because you're familiar with it in Egyptian dialect. So it's not really new, it's just like a new feature. Does this feature exist in other languages? We had a really interesting conversation a few years ago where we were talking about address forms and, being polite. And students were able to pull on their knowledge of a wide variety of languages, French, Pashto, Spanish, other languages, to think about, how we use language to mark different address forms and how these are similar and different. And they remembered, even though we were using, other languages outside of Arabic, they remembered this discussion, and they ended up actually remembering the Arabic features a lot more. The specific, I think we're talking about and things like this. They remembered it a lot more than if I had just been like, oh, this is the formal one, this is the informal one. And you have experience with other linguistic variations. So sometimes our students' linguistic repertoires, and again, this goes back to the idea of recognizing the resources of socially marginalized groups, even if it's not in that specific language context, they might have a lot of experience shifting between varieties of one language or dialects of one language. So for example, I had a student a few years ago who proudly identified as a speaker of African American vernacular English, and then described, how she would use this variety with her friends and her family, and then she would use a different variety in school. And when I pointed out that that's very similar to the situation in the Arab world, where you speak local dialects at home or in social settings, then you have standard Arabic that you use in educational settings, she'd never thought about it this way. And she never realized that she had this resource already. She understood how this worked, just in a different language. And so things like this, when you point them out to students, or when they make these connections themselves, it doesn't always have to be the teacher pointing it out, can be a really useful way of helping expand that linguistic repertoire. And again, having clear expectations for what you're expecting by presenting texts in a variety of dialects. It's not, well, now I want you to be able to describe a holiday in Egyptian Arabic, and then in Moroccan Arabic, and then in Syrian Arabic. Again, that's sort of a monolingual perspective. You should be able to do this equally in all these different dialects. But to say, no, these are resources, you're going to want to talk to people from all of these geographic locations. And so this is the start, to help you get there, to be able to understand a lot of these varieties. And so separating between these receptive and productive abilities. And then, to get to the idea of, isn't this confusing? This is a question I get a lot. Maybe, but so many things are confusing in language learning. There's confusing grammatical concepts, there's hard sounds to make, and this is just the reality of the languages and the linguistic situations we teach. All right, I think we're almost out of time, so I'm gonna go through this quickly, but again, I mentioned earlier, I think it's crucial to engage in explicit discussions of language ideologies with our students to help them identify these ideologies, describe them. Again, they could choose ideology different from the one that we support. If someone wants to stick with monolingual language ideologies and they're aware of that and they can describe that, that is a difference of opinion. As I said, there's no ideologically neutral approach. But in many cases, I think it's a lack of awareness. We can help them critique native speaker competencies. Think about, what does this exactly mean? What native speakers are we talking about? Is this really the judgment we want to be making? That this person is the ideal native speaker and this person is the non-standard native speaker. What exactly are we judging there? Probably not their language. Same thing, standardized forms. And this brings us into the concept of ratiolinguistic ideologies. And this is especially important in the context of the United States that I'm more familiar with, but I think applies many places. So understanding how a lot of times our beliefs about language and race are intertwined. And again, of course, just addressing this in our language classrooms isn't going to, end these inequities on its own. But this is our sphere of influence, is how I think of it. And so this is kind of where we can start. And again, sometimes people say this is outside the scope of language classes, but I would argue that it really isn't, because we use language as a social activity and to do our social activities. And then another question is often, what about assessment? And I do want to mention on this briefly before I get to the end and can answer all the rest of the questions. Because a lot of our assessments really are based in these monolingual language ideologies. You're expected to perform monolingually at a certain standard that's often based on this idealized native speaker standard. So that is just the reality. And we don't always have control over the language assessments students will take. We don't necessarily have the power to change these assessments outside of our classrooms or even inside our classrooms sometimes. But there is emerging research that shows that attention to these language ideologies and to the metalinguistic awareness requires an extensive focus on language. And this can actually help in traditional assessments, because instead of just seeing this as like, I have to speak this, form that I don't speak, or I have to sound like this person, you can kind of, you develop an awareness of these metalinguistic forms and analyzing it. And it can provide, in some ways it can have positive results on some of these tests. So I will conclude with that. And if you'd like to share in the comments, how you create transformative spaces, or any other questions. I'm happy to try to answer those. And you can also connect with me via email or on social media at Emma Trentman. And then I also have a blog where I write a lot about incorporating these practices into my classroom and my thoughts on that. So I'd be happy to connect with you at any of these ways. And then if there's any more questions, I can go ahead and or comments about how you're creating transformative spaces. Let me go back to that one. Let me know, and Chantal, you could read them.
Yeah, please do keep sharing those in the chat. And also, I just want to note that many people have been talking about how meaningful and helpful this presentation is. So we'll make sure that all of those comments also go to you after the talk. I know because we're short on time, a lot of the things that were coming up in the questions you already anticipated. I was kind of laughing because assessment was definitely one that came up. So maybe too, I thought this was a really important question that was asked by somebody, which relates to, often teachers, those of us who teach a language that is not one of our first languages, often feel like our own linguistic repertoire also has its limitations. And so do you have any suggestions for teachers being reflective in their own practice? For example, about when are they switching or moving between languages because it's strategic, and when is that an indication of the limits of their own linguistic repertoire, and how can we deal with that as teachers who are also language learners in some cases?
Yeah, so I teach a language that I did not grow up speaking, Arabic. So I understand definitely and appreciate this question. And I would say, for me, this is one of the most important things about this translingual perspective, is I really feels like it gives us as teachers, who might not know every single word that comes up in every single text our students encounter on the internet or wherever, permission to be those language learners and to show how we're using our own linguistic repertoires to expand them. So certainly when I'm pulling from multi-dialectal materials, I don't understand everything. And so I ask someone for help, and I say, what does this mean? And then I get to learn as well, and I get to share that with my students. So if something comes up, I might have the opportunity in class to show how I'm going to use Google Translate, but then I'm also going to check it by Googling it to make sure I actually got the right word, or how I might use it to figure out the pronunciation, or all the ways in which, I'm continually expanding my linguistic repertoire. And I think, being able to come and see that as like an opportunity and a resource, and to show how I'm learning too, rather than feeling like I failed because I don't sound like someone who grew up in Egypt, or I don't have that exact same linguistic repertoire as, a monolingual Arabic speaker, I think is really important. And so I think, I've talked a lot about students here, but I think this perspective can be really transformative for us as teachers as well, and especially for those of us who teach languages that aren't our first languages, or that we didn't grow up speaking, and might, sort of always feel like we're struggling or deficient in.
I think that's really helpful. I've seen quite a few people noting that this helps us to also reflect and reframe on what it is that what are we doing when we're teaching languages as well, and that becoming a monolithic ideal of a native speaker is a kind of demotivating goal, since it's an impossibility. And also some people noting that if you teach students who maybe are coming in also with different linguistic repertoires in terms of their literacy, that this can open up those spaces. So maybe just one last question because of time, which was for people who are really excited about this after hearing your talk, in addition to your works that we've already highlighted, do you have any particular resources you would point people towards?
Yeah, so I think there's, the one, from a theoretical perspective, the article I usually recommend is that when I cited with a quote, I think it's in the references on my slide. So I did put all the references that I cited. If you go, it's here, you probably can't read this, but if you look at the PDF, they're there. And so what I'll highlight is this one here, the 2015 article is really helpful from a theoretical perspective. And then this one just came out in Actful's language educator, which I think is, helpful. And this does, I sort of went quickly through this at the end because of time, but I think really tying this to anti-racism in our classrooms is, important in creating these transformative spaces. Other resources, I think just also, talking with language teachers and with your students and with each other, sometimes the best way to sort of understand these concepts is to try them out in class and think through them. This is, I write about these on my blog, not just to share information, but also to help understand them myself. And it helps me think through this. So, definitely reach out to me. Those are the two that I would highlight. And I think, I'm trying to think if there's any others off the top of my head. If you have resources, I know there were some people in the chat who were already familiar with translanguaging, so please put your own resources in the chat too, and maybe those could be collected as well.
That's great. And we are going to leave the webinar, including the chat, open for a few more minutes. Please do take that time to also complete the poll if you haven't already. You'll also be receiving a questionnaire at your email that will give us some additional feedback. And these, I cannot understate how important these resources are. Your feedback for us also continuing to fund events like this and webinars like this. But at this point, I want to thank Dr. Emma Trentman for this really wonderful talk. I see many of you also doing the same. So I'll have to clap on behalf of all of us, but we'll make sure that all of the praises and kind words from the chat go to her. Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. This is really helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for having me. And thank you to everyone for coming and for sharing your experiences. It looks, I haven't been following the chat, but I can see that there's a lot going on, and it seems that a lot of people have really good ideas. So that's exciting to see.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. Oh, there we go. We even get translanguaging in the thank yous.
Momtastic, which is my favorite Arabic language learner translanguaging phrase. So momtaz is like fantastic, so you get momtastic.
Yes, and some of you were asking about references and contact info. Those are in the slides. We have those up at the website now as well. So I tried to get as many of your questions in there as I could. You all had a lot of great questions, yeah. Now you know where to find her. And also, I'm going to go ahead and put a plug in. I think your work is a really great starting place for people thinking about translanguaging. So.
Oh yeah, I do academic articles too. You can read those. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone.